Becoming a disciple. You know, I share a lot. I probably share too much about my personal life with y'all. But one of the things I enjoy in life is teaching. And one of the best compliments I've ever received in ministry, I think in my opinion, best compliment, with former church pastor, was not that I'm a great preacher, great orator. I'm not much of a preacher, as I tell people. But one of the best compliments somebody gave me was, "You're a good teacher." Now, whether that's true or not, I'll let y'all be the judge of that. But one thing I found is that when it comes to students, I teach, kind of my side gig is teaching for Gardner-Webb as an adjunct in the Department of Religious Studies and Philosophy. When it comes to students, you have to have students who are willing to learn, or at least go through the hoops. I had the pleasure of teaching the youth class today. We were talking about stuff you don't want to do, homework and things like that. But there's always those students who don't want to learn. And several of you who are educators or have been in school, most of you have been in school, I hope, there have been times where you don't want to do. Well, the joys of the program I teach for Gardner-Webb is I get students from all over majors, different types of majors. Gardner-Webb is one of those schools that's a Baptist-affiliated school that still requires an Old Testament class and a New Testament class before you graduate. Everybody has to take it or have had taken it at another school before they graduate. Well, that's good and bad, because as a person who teaches Old Testament and New Testament, I'll get students in my class that have no desire whatsoever to be in that class. They're taking that class because they have to. And I've had students tell me to my face, "I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here whatsoever, but I have to take your class, and I have to pass if I want to graduate." I was like, well, I'll try to make it as painless as I can. Although I usually make it more painful than it needs to be. I'm mean that way. As I tell my boys, I'm a mean person. But you have to be willing to learn. You have to be willing to be molded and shaped for a class to be successful. You don't have to, and I tell my students, you don't have to agree with everything that I tell you, everything I show you, but you have to be open. We're going to talk today about becoming a disciple, and what most Christians don't realize is that when we become a disciple or a follower of Jesus, we're essentially becoming a student. We have the greatest teacher ever who has taught us through the Scriptures, Jesus. And His Spirit the Holy Spirit speaks to us today, teaching and guiding us throughout life. As a Christian, we are called to be disciples. In fact, the Great Commission tells us to make disciples, to make other students. But we as students need to be of a certain mindset. We're going to look at today at a story of the calling of Peter and some of the first disciples. And we're going to look at some attributes that we as disciples need to have in order to be molded and shaped by God to be the Christians that we need to be, the disciples that we need to be. So let's look at Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. As a crowd was pressing in on Jesus to hear God's word, he was standing by Lake Gennesaret. He saw two boats at the edge of the lake. The fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, which belonged to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the land. Then he sat down and was teaching the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." "Master," Simon replied, "we've worked hard all night long and caught nothing. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets." When they did this, they caught a great number of fish, and their nets began to tear. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. They came and filled both boats so full they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, because I'm a sinful." For he and all those with him were amazed at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, Zebedee's sons, who were Simon's partners. "Don't be afraid," Jesus told Simon. "From now on, you will be catching people." Then he brought the boats to land and left everything and followed him. And I went too far, didn't I? There we go. Trying to read the Bible instead of reading the text. So this story is a classic story, and you probably have read this story multiple times and know the story backwards and forwards. But let's think about Simon Peter today and Jesus calling him. Now, if you think back to the life of Simon Peter, he wasn't always the best disciple. I often resonate a little bit with the disciple Peter, Simon Peter, because I have this disease. Y'all may have this disease too, called chronic foot and mouth disease. You ever have that? Where you chronically find your foot in your mouth? Peter was one of those guys. I get the impression, I don't know the guy, I never met him. Maybe I'll meet him in glory one day. But by reading the New Testament, reading the Gospels, it seems to be he's one of those guys that kind of acts before he thinks. Sometimes he says stuff probably before he should. Now, insert foot in mouth. We find in the garden he was one of those anxious ones. When Jesus was there, he was one of the anxious ones to overthrow the Romans and go. But Jesus healed the guy's ear, and they were good to go. Simon Peter also was the one who denied Jesus 3 times. He's also the one that Jesus asked, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Well, feed my sheep. So Peter wasn't the perfect disciple, and no disciple ever is. No student is perfect. Only the master can be perfect, and our master, Jesus, is perfect. But there are 3 attributes in this story I want us to look at with Simon Peter, and us to ask ourselves the question, do we have these attributes in our life, in our Christian walk? The first one is over in verse 5 where Peter is talking about, we've worked hard all night and caught nothing. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets. Jesus had asked him to put the nets back out. Imagine all night, which most fishermen back in that day fished at night. Imagine working hard all night and there's no fruit to his labors. Peter's probably worn out. He wants to go home. Maybe he wants to eat, wants to lay down. I don't know, but those things probably flood in his mind. And Jesus says, well, just a little bit longer. Just throw your net out there. Now think about this. Now Peter is a lifetime fisherman. It's his job. It's his vocation. This is a thing he has done many times. But who's this Jesus, this son of a carpenter, to tell me to throw my net back into the water? I know better than him. I don't like to be told, me personally, I don't like to be told what to do because I know better than everybody else. Sadly, I don't. But notice what Peter did. Instead of saying, I know better than you, Jesus, instead of saying, I've already done that, Jesus, there's no use doing it, guess what he did? He says, well, but if you say so, I'll let down the nets. You see, Peter exhibited potential. He may have disagreed with it. He may not want to do it. But he trusted and did it. There's potential there. He had faith. I've had students oftentimes tell me, and even church members, I don't necessarily agree with what you're saying, but I'll give you a minute or two to listen. That's all I need. That's all God needs in our life is just a little bit of trust, a little bit of potential. And once God gets that inch, he can make miles out of it. God needs potential in our life. Is there potential in you? See, sad thing is, many of us as disciples, we're like Pharaoh, aren't we? What was wrong with Pharaoh's heart? It was hard, wasn't it? Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he wasn't receptive to God. Instead of having a hard heart, we need to have a new heart, like the prophets talk about, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, a soft heart, a heart willing to be worked on by God. Maybe there's something in your life that's hard in your heart, taking away from the potential. Maybe it's your stubbornness. Now, I hadn't been here too long at this church, but I do know that some of you are like me. You're hard-headed as a goat. You're stubborn. Maybe we need to set that aside. Maybe we're too self-centered. Some of us are that way. Maybe that takes away from our potential, our willingness, that inch that God needs. Maybe we're too busy complaining and moaning and groaning, like the Israelites in the desert, for God to act in that potential. God needs that potential. That's what a good disciple has, is that potential, that bit of faith to trust and do what he asks you to do. It don't take much. But Peter also, besides the potential, also had humility. Look over in verse 8. After the fish had filled the boats and the boats were about to sink, Simon Peter saw this. He fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me because I'm a sinful man, Lord." Humility. Oh, mercy me. We need a lot of humility, don't we? Humility is very important. You see, humility realizes that we're not the center of the world. We live in a culture today where it's all about the me, isn't it? I mean, you look at social media. I'm on social media way too much. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, all these things, you name it. Unfortunately, I've been on it. But you'll notice a lot of these social medias that tend to emphasize the me and how important I am in this world. In fact, I was talking the other day about Instagram to, I think it was the Wednesday night crowd. Instagram is the social media of me and the vanity. You're taking pictures of yourself and put them on this website. It's where people can see you in all your glory or unglory, I guess you could say. We live in a very self-centered me culture. I call it the Burger King generation, if you will, the Burger King age. Burger King had that slogan, "Have it your way and have it now." It's all about me and what I want. Last time I read the scriptures and last time I talked to God about it, it ain't about me, it's about Him. It's about us being humble and saying, "God, your will, not mine." It's about Peter getting on his knees, falling before Jesus. So I ain't good enough. I ain't good enough. Recall the story in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah's in the temple. God gives him this vision in the temple, and it's just, this is the glory and the majesty. And there's these angels, these wings that cover their feet, and it's just an amazing, awe-inspiring scene of God's glory. Isaiah says, "I'm undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in a land of people of unclean lips." So what does God do? Angels take a coal, touch it to his lips in this vision, and it purifies him for service to God. You see, we don't have to be perfect to be one of God's disciples. We don't have to be perfect to come to God, to accept God, and to do His work in this world. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be humble and saying, "God, I can't do it, but you can." So, "God, I can't do it alone. I can't do it at all. I need you. I need you." Because, like Peter said, I'm a sinful man. I'm a sinful man. Go away from me. One of my favorite passages in the Scripture is passage Jeremiah, the image of the potter and the clay. That metaphor for God molding and shaping people is powerful. I've never really worked much with clay and pottery. I've been around a little bit. But I do know this, that you can't make a pot out of hardened clay that's already been baked. You have to have clay that is moldable, bendable, shapeable. You have to have a little bit of water to make it that way in order to make something beautiful and great. You see, the problem is God needs us to be moldable and shapeable and humble before Him in order to make us into what we need to be. Here's a quote here. This is from Thomas Merton, a great Catholic monk and thinker. I just love his writings. "Humility sets us free to do what is really good by showing us our illusions and drawing our will from what was only an apparent good." Humility sets us free to do what is really good by showing us our illusions and withdrawing our will from what was only an apparent good. Humility, in other words, sets us free. Sets us free from all the lies that we're good enough, the lies that we can do it alone, we can do it on our own. I hate to tell you this, but if you're trying to live this life on your own, you're going to find out pretty darn quick, if you haven't already, you can't do it alone. You can't do it alone. We need somebody higher. We need God in our life. Because if you're trying to do it alone, you're going to drive yourself crazy and you're going to fail. Now, I do believe that there's mental illness and there's chemical imbalances and all that stuff, but I tell you, there's a lot of people in this world that are seeing professional help. And I think, and this is my anecdotal evidence here, I don't have any hard concrete evidence, but there's a lot of people seeing professional help that are trying to do this life alone, and they're running themselves crazy. You can't do it alone. You can't do it without God. We need to be humble enough to admit, God, I need you. God, I need you. You see, Peter's response to Jesus' miraculous work is important. There's this notion of what God would want a sinner to do is show humility. You see, admitting our inability and sinfulness shows our dependence upon God. We can't do it alone. We can't. But not only did Peter have potential, Peter have humility, but Peter had a willingness to work. A willingness to work. In verse 10, it says, the second part of verse 10, don't be afraid, Jesus told Simon. From now on, you'll be catching people. You'll be a fisher of men, as some of the translations say. Be fisher of men. Simon's called to work, gathering people, rescuing them from a fallen world. We are called to go out and to make disciples. The Great Commission tells us that in Matthew. Go out and make disciples. We have to do something. As a disciple, we can't just sit here on our tails and expect everything to be okay. We just buried one of our church members yesterday. Of course, she hadn't been here in a while because of illness. But sadly, since I've been at this congregation, a little over 6 months I've been here, we've buried too many. Our numbers are dying off. There's not enough in these pews. There's a lot of empty spaces in this pew that need to be filled. There's a lot of churches in our community that are experiencing the same thing. I went to a meeting for the chicken and dumplings the other day, and some of the other churches, the Methodist churches and Lutheran churches, are like, we're all getting too old, and we're dying off. And honestly, I'm convinced part of the issue is we're not putting in the work that we need to do as Christians to be out in this community making a difference, to reach the lost, and to rescue those that have backslidden. We need to be out in this community more, working. Peter is called to be a fisher of men. That's a wonderful analogy, a wonderful metaphor. You see, Peter had been out all night the night before fishing, hadn't caught a darn thing. Hadn't caught anything. Evangelism is like that, isn't it? Evangelism is hard work. It takes time, and it can wear us out. And also, evangelism all the time isn't always fruitful. You can't just go out and share the gospel in our community with somebody, or have a one-on-one relationship leading them to Christ, and then all of a sudden it just clicks. It takes time. It takes hard work. Some of the best Christians I've seen are people that a loved one or a friend has been and sharing the gospel with them and working on them for years. At a former congregation, had a deacon who, a good man, he and his wife had been out of church for years. But people in the congregation kept working on him, praying for him, visiting, loving on him. And about 7 years later, he's back in the church and working hard for God. It takes time. It takes hard work. It takes us doing what we need to do to reach the lost. Evangelism isn't easy. Sharing the good news isn't easy, but we have to do it. Cute little illustration here. Some grandchildren asked their grandmother what she planned to do when she got to heaven. She replied, "Well, I've worked hard all my life. So when I get to heaven, I plan to sit in a rocking chair for 10,000 years. Then I'll start rocking just a little bit." Well, Revelation indicates otherwise, doesn't it? Revelation 22:3 says, His servants shall serve Him. We will work in heaven, only we won't get tired. Otherwise, heaven would soon become hell, for we're made to work. If you think you're going to work down here just a little bit and get to heaven, you're going to relax. That's where the work happens too, serving God. But the important thing is we start down here and working. We live in a society where some people don't want to work. I've run into people that don't want to work. They don't, especially when I work in the grocery business, there's people that want a job, they want a paycheck, but they don't want to work. The sad thing is there's a lot of Christians like that. There's some Christians maybe here today that are like that. You want the benefits of doing the hard work of discipleship and evangelism, but you don't want to invest and do the work. And I'm not saying you have to go out and knock on doors and share a gospel tract with somebody. That may be fruitful for some, but that's not always the way you share the gospel and share the good news and reach others for Jesus. It's through building relationships. It's through living the life. I think one of the best ways we can share the gospel in this world, in this postmodern world, this post-evangelical world, somebody even say post-Christian world is, let others see Jesus in you. Because we can argue all day long about Jesus' resurrection and how it happened and try to prove it in many proofs. That's what apologetics, this discipline called apologetics, tries to do. They try to prove things in a rational way. We could try to prove things all we want. But as we live our life and we show others Jesus in us, that lets people know about the good news of Christ. Of course, we do need to do the legwork. We do need to go out and tell people. We need to be there to share the good news, to be that shoulder to cry on for somebody who's hurting, to tell people that God loves them. We need to do that. One of the things I hope to do with the next deacons meeting and some other aspects of the church, maybe on Wednesday nights, if eventually, is we need to talk a little bit more about evangelism. Being out in this community and sharing the good news a little bit more. Reaching those that have fallen to the wayside, but reaching also those that are lost. I bet you if we were to go down to Ingalls or go down to the neighborhood Walmart or go to one of the grocery stores, we'd see a ton of people in there. Because for them, Sunday's just another day. Come springtime, there'll be a lot of people out mowing the grass during the church hour. Because for them, Sunday is just another day. And I bet you those people are hurting too. They may not realize they're hurting. But I bet you this world's beating them down. They don't have anywhere to turn, excuse me. They need the hope of Jesus Christ in their life. They need the hope, and we need to tell them about it. We need to show it to them. You see, Peter had potential. He had humility. He had a willingness to work. He had potential. He put aside his own stubbornness, his own inhibition, had a little bit of faith. What do we have to put aside today? Is it our stubbornness? Is it our hard-headedness? Our self-centeredness? We need the humility to say, God, I need you. I can't do it without you. You know, Moses, I love the call story of Moses. I can't speak too good, God. You can still do it. I'll send Aaron out with you, God said. Well, by the time all things said and done, Moses was a powerful leader for his people, for God. He could do it. He had to be humble and let God work in him. And we have to have a humility to be willing to work and do the work for God, to share the good news and put in the time. You know, I keep hearing from people, we need to make this church grow. We need to have more tails in the pews. Put it in kind of a more crass way. But we also need to put in the work to do it. We've got to put aside our inhibitions, our self, our stubbornness, and trust in God. I'm not saying we'll have 300 and 400, 500, 600,000 billion people in this church, but as long as we rescue one from the gates of hell, it's worth it. We just have to invest the work. As musicians come and as we sing, do you have potential, humility, and a willingness to work? The altar is open if you'd like to come